I was like, so how are you pricing this? And we're going to ask you how we should price this. And all three of us had gone to the same fancy business school. And so I was like, well, according to business school, we would be maximizing our returns.
What would happen if we just told the truth?
Welcome to TruthWorks, where we dig into the nitty-gritty of leadership and work.
And what needs to change. I'm Jessica Neal.
And I'm Patty McCord.
Our journey together started in HR, but trust us, it's evolved into something wild, honest, and well, a bit rebellious.
So throw out the handbook. We're here to redefine rules to work for us, not against us.
Let's dive into another episode.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of TruthWorks. I'm Patty McCord here with Jessica Neal, and our guest today is a pal of mine who I've known for a number of years, Jacqueline Novogratz. It's funny, I was thinking about you this morning, and I was thinking about how many women CEOs I know who have come from like corporate finance and at one point just said, fuck it, I'm done with that. I need to do something important. And Jacqueline's the founder of Acumen, which is an investment company. I'm going to let you tell all about your story and about that invests in companies in Africa and does amazing work and has an amazing perspective on how we think about global finance and the people that are involved in it from all different levels and all different walks of earth. So give us your elevator story of you and how you came to be you and all that good stuff.
Okay, Patty and Jessica, it's so good to be here. And I have followed you, Patty, for many, many years. And I'm a true fangirl for everything that you have done, built at Netflix, and then gave of yourself to the world in terms of helping all of us mere mortals as we've tried to build talent systems, which is really at the heart of change. So just huge kudos. I don't know if there's a quick elevator pitch, but as short as I can, I actually left Wall Street as a baby banker. I'd only been there for a little over 3 years, so I was 25, but I had worked in 40 countries and gotten a real flavor for the international economic system way back in the early 1980s, and then found myself in Rwanda 7 years before the genocide. And I helped a small group of Rwandan women co-found the country's first microfinance bank. So I learned that a small group of people could change history, really, in a country. And I also learned that it's not enough to give poor people access to the tools of finance. You have to also support them to have greater capability in terms of how to use those tools. And then I guess finally that, which connects to what you've done so long, that dignity is more important to the spirit than wealth. And yet when we think about poverty, what we often go to is income. How many dollars a day did you earn? And so it was with all of that in 2001, I started Acumen with one big idea at the center, that if we could take philanthropy and rather than simply give it away, we could invest in entrepreneurs, which I truly believe in, who were trying to solve big problems of poverty, electrification, healthcare, agriculture, education. And if we stayed with them, hence patient capital, for 15 to 20 years, accompanying them with the capability building that they needed, access to our social networks. And if we measured their impact, not just their returns, maybe we could actually solve some of these big problems in ways that neither markets nor traditional charity had ever done. That model has morphed over past 2 decades to a 4-part model. One that recognizes that entrepreneurial people are often the biggest agents of change. And I believe in it more than ever. So we start with Acumen Academy, which is both online and in-person school for social change. We've trained about 1,650 leaders and have had 1 million people take courses online where they learn the tools of what we call moral leadership, which is not just what it sounds like, but resilience, grit, holding opposing ideas in tension, building from that perspective so that we could include people who have been overlooked and underserved. Some of those go on to receive money from Acumen Ventures, the second part of what we do, which is now two-part. We have our traditional model of taking philanthropy where we can build markets that never before existed. And then we have another 800 million soon in the next 18 months that we'll be managing under a for-profit investing portfolio. In some cases, we get close. We see that we've maybe reached 100, 200 million people through these two buckets of investing. And then to really solve problems, we build alliances with other partners. And then we take the insights from that work and push it through Acumen Academy again. So we've become more of a value chain with a deeper belief now than 35 years ago that change at scale is possible if we break away from the binary of investing as usual on the one hand or philanthropy or charity as usual on the other hand.
I can't believe it's been over 2 decades. It's incredible how much difference you've made over that. I'm just so proud of you. The conversation I thought would be interesting to have. So Jessica and I worked together at Netflix. She actually did my job after I left. She did her job. I'm sorry. She had the same job title as me for a bunch of years at Netflix. And she did all the global expansion.
Oh, wow.
And now Jessica's a VC. And so what I thought would be a really interesting thing for us to talk about today that's maybe different than what people normally ask you about is about VC, venture capital and investment and sort of what Jessica looks for in an entrepreneur and what you look for in an entrepreneur and what those similarities are. And the other part about just, how do we rethink that whole, you've done so much great work on rethinking how to invest, how to look. I love that you have that long-term perspective because Jessica, I'd love to hear from your side. Like, is it still like, I want my money now? Or are venture capitalists willing to look further ahead? So that's sort of what I wanted to set us up to do today because I thought it'd be really interesting with both of you here. So, et voila, talk amongst yourselves.
I had one question for Jacqueline before we get started. The blue sweater.
The blue sweater
I just
story.
want to hear about the blue sweater just a little bit from you because, I was reading about it, but it just seems so crazy to me that could even happen.
It's crazy when you go back to 1986, because that was a time when the world was not as connected as the world is today by any stretch of the imagination. Most of the people I knew truly thought that Africa consisted of a single country and would never have been able to name Rwanda. But it starts when I was like 10 years old and I'd been given this blue sweater from my Uncle Ed. It had a zebra in the front, mountains across the chest. I love this sweater. I'm one of 7 kids, so we didn't have a lot of sweaters. And I wore it until my adolescent curves were sort of reshaping the contours of the sweater. And there's that singular moment of mortification in every young teenager's life. Mine was when my high school nemesis screamed across all the football players something very lewd about how I was filling out this sweater. And I ran home to my mother, asked her how she could possibly let me wear it. And we ceremoniously threw it into the Goodwill. And I thought I'd never have to see it again. Literally fast forward 10 years. And now I am starting this microfinance bank. I'm jogging through the hills of Kigali. And I see 10 feet in front of me, this little 10-year-old and this sweater, which was my sweater. And I'm literally in Kigali. And so I ran up to the poor child. I grabbed this sweater by the neck and I turned it. And there was my name written on the tag of the sweater. And the child, of course, was terrified, ran away.
Yeah, here's this lady grabbing me by the neck.
I thought we were fated in some ways to know each other. I never saw him again. But I've held that story as a talisman, if you will, metaphorical talisman for the idea that we truly are that interconnected as a world, and our action and our inaction can impact people we may never meet, never know, frankly, every day of our lives. And And my life has continually threaded back to Kigali in ways mysterious and not mysterious. And yeah, and I believe even more, not just in our interconnectedness, but in our interdependence, and really think that that frame has to shape the way we reimagine and rebuild all of our systems, financial, political, and social.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I just when I was reading and doing research about you, I just was like, that is such an amazing story. But maybe that's a good segue into Patty's question for us, which is, how does the blue sweater interconnection story have an impact on who you invest with, how you pick investors? What sort of lens do you have?
No one's ever asked me that question, and I appreciate it, Jessica. I would say that, we all go on these journeys. And when I first moved to Rwanda, having grown up in a cowboy family of, very strong men, 4 brothers and 2 sisters, I wasn't your likely candidate to start a women's bank. I didn't really think that women were that different. I thought actually women were stronger than men. And yet when I moved to Rwanda, not only were women not given voice and not given rights, when I first got there, they couldn't open a bank account without their husband's permission and signature. But it was so easy to use women in ways that took out men's own insecurities in so many ways. I ended up starting a bakery simultaneously as we were doing the bank with a group of 20 women who were called prostitutes. And when I got to know them, they were really just single mothers. But it was so easy to give them a nomenclature that diminished them further. And I would say that that whole experience reinforced for me that markets are incredibly powerful and I believe in them. And yet, when people don't even feel like they belong, don't know how to access, don't have the skills, the tools, nor frankly, the welcome, then we have to work with markets, but learn how to control them and not let them control us. And that was really a big part of my early basic education, coming from being a fancy Wall Street banker into a place that was just moving out of a barter society into a market society, and realizing that who got to play really mattered. And so that's how the blue sweater has continued to flow through. Every investment that Acumen makes is made in a way that starts with the question, how are we using investment as a tool, as a means to solve a problem of poverty? We don't start with the capital that we have and then look for ways to maximize our financial returns. We look for the problem that we want to solve, whether it be electrification. And then we build the right capital structures that allow the entrepreneurs the time, the resources, the connections, so that they can have the best possible chance of solving them.
And you did a stint with the Rockefeller Center, so you had also done the classical training in classical philanthropy. And were there lessons that you learned from that experience that said, look, this doesn't work or this does work? Because your approach to this is not radical now, but it sure was radical when you started doing it. I mean,
Yeah.
I love the part about, like, you and I both, you came from a military family. I moved all the time too. I just listened to a podcast where you said, yeah, I had, 9 teachers by the 5th grade. I had 12 by the 6th grade. Right. And so I think it gives us a way to just look fresh at people all of the time. But was that experience, did it affect the way you redid it when you did it on your own?
Absolutely. In positive and negative ways. The positive was that the man who was president when I first went to Rockefeller as a fellow is still on my advisory, Peter Goldmark, and he is one of the biggest thinkers I've ever known in my life, and still is.
Wow.
And so
saying
back
a lot.
to 1991, he would talk about the ultimata facing our world. 1991. And so he was like, we have to look at what's happening with nuclear. We have to understand climate change way before anybody was really looking at these issues. Goldmark was like, Novogratz, you got to learn to think systems from a systems perspective. And that was the positive of being around someone like him. And he had this strategy that he would call the Kong Kong strategy, where he had a few of us who he called, affectionately his cowboys. And he sort of let us run and break rules.
Uh-huh.
And we didn't fully fit into the institution, but we were able to use the resources, the access of the institution. One of those guys was a man named Seth Berkley, who went on to start the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, and then he ran the Global Alliance for Vaccine Initiatives. Seth is still cowboy-like, and he has moved billions of dollars into vaccines for the poor. And one was Anthony Romero, who would become the head of the ACLU. And so I think about gold marks. One, think of the big systems you want to change, and two, bet on people who aren't afraid to look stupid, take on really big bets, and back them. The negative was being inside big older institutions that had a lot of money, but not the incentives to fully account for how that money was spent in terms of the impact that was created. And so I learned that many of the people there might be comfortable looking at a budget, but not able to tell you a story from the numbers that they were seeing. Not connecting it to financial sustainability, the long-term viability of an institution. We never talked about true institution building and scale. And so often in institutions like that, and I would say the academy is similar, you gain power by amassing more budget, looking really smart. And one thing elites are great at doing is throwing words and symbols at each other to make yourself sound very, very smart, and in a funny way, exclude the group from having a true conversation about the problem that you're trying to solve. And so when I started thinking about how would we do this differently, it was one, ideas are great, but show me a builder who's willing to put their whole life into solving a problem. We can then figure out the right kind of capital, but we've got to be connected to that person in terms of how we will build their sustainability. Two, trying to move to a place not of showing how smart you were, but showing how committed you were to actually creating change. So at the very beginning, when we didn't have as many investments as we have across the world now, on a quarterly basis, I would force the team to do a forced ranking. So we look at all our investments, 1 through X. And I would say, like, you're not going to get fired if you say my investment is the worst in the portfolio. You're actually going to start a great conversation. But if you try to present your dog of an investment as beautiful, that's when I will start to take you on and possibly let you go. Because we've got to get more truly serious about solving problems rather than showing a face to the world that says, look how good we are.
I want to stop you for a second because there's two really important lessons you just talked about for our listeners. One of them is, I love that you said you have to teach people to tell a story about the data. God, I mean, I wish I could take every CFO I've ever worked with and just say, let's take 6 months and just teach you how to tell a story. Or Jessica, think about all the people who just operate with data brains. Reed Hastings, Jessica and I both worked with Reed. And that was one of Reed's things that he worked on his whole life was.
And he got incredibly good at it.
Yeah, how to tell a story about the data. And the other one was, I love what you just said, which is, look, if it's broken and you tell me it's pretty, the issue isn't that it's broken. The issue is that you told me it was pretty.
Well, yeah, and I think you're talking about something that I try to sift through on a day-to-day basis too. And I work at a firm and we do both public and private investing, and you do have these folks who are incredibly smart, who sound really smart. But the part that you talked about was that, like, life commitment. Because, like, if you really want to change the world and do something that's disruptive and successful, you have to be so passionate and so committed about it. And there's, we've talked a little bit about grit, but it's that grit, it's that determination, it's the, you know, drooling every morning thinking about this thing that you want to do. And you can't wait to get up out of bed and do it. And those, to me, those are the ones that have a fighting chance at actually doing it versus the ones who just sound really smart and seem great, right? But at the bottom of it, when you dig deeper, they don't have what's in their core to actually do it.
Jacqueline, can you tell us a story about somebody that it has the core and maybe isn't somebody we would pick out of a lineup to say, oh, there's an entrepreneur that's going to be successful and change the world?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many now.
Yeah.
When you were talking, Jessica, because I agree with you, I think determination is probably the single most important quality for a great entrepreneur. There were co-founders of a company called D-Light, Necip Tozen and Sam Goldman, who came into our offices in 2007 when there were 1.5 billion people without electrification. And it was so crazy for them to say that they were going to eradicate kerosene, which is what those 1.5 billion people typically use to light their homes. Expensive, dirty, terrible for the planet. And yet nobody else was trying. We were super young. And so we took a bet on them. And I remember my first trip in India with them. And I was like, so how are you pricing this? And they're like, we're going to ask you how we should price this. And all three of us had gone to the same fancy business school. And so I was like, well, according to business school, we would be maximizing our returns. And so if you flip it, and what we're trying to do is actually maximize consumer impact, consumer preference, then we have to flip the whole model. And what does that look like? It was that basic. Like, we didn't know how to price it. They didn't know how to distribute it. They had no financing model. They had no marketing model. And man, were they in it. And they made mistake after mistake after mistake. And they helped me understand the definition of patient capital, where I was like, how patient is our capital? And it turns out it's very patient. We're still in the company 17 years later, although we exited all of our Series A and of all of our seed money, but we kept, that company has reached 150 million people now with
Wow.
light and electricity. But more than that, and I don't know if this happens with you, Jessica, but they opened up a whole journey for us. We started to see that this big, hairy 1.5 billion person problem was actually eminently solvable.
Mm-hmm.
And that it wasn't just D-Light, but other solar lighting companies that would be needed. So we started investing, and then that taught us we needed to build out the ecosystem with interoperability and with net metering and with financing companies and distribution companies. And this little tiny ecosystem then was opening up adjacent possibilities. So as the solar companies started to build their distribution, people didn't need Coca-Cola anymore. They could sell solar irrigation and cell phones and cook stoves and solar televisions. And so now our education company in Kenya reaches 14 million kids a day through solar television, mostly all distributed through the solar companies. And as a total portfolio, our companies have reached 230 million of the poorest people in the world with electrification. That then lets us say, okay, how radical can we get? If you start with the problem that you want to solve.
Yes.
Right? And you know that the low-income people will pay if they're given a price that is affordable, and you're not maniacally obsessed on profitability, but you need enough profitability to sustain these companies, then there's nothing you shouldn't be able to do. And so now we've taken on a $250 million initiative to invest both in the big companies like D-Light and in locally run companies in places like Malawi and Somalia and Zambia and Burkina Faso, the least electrified countries in the world, with this very audacious goal of getting electricity to ultimately everyone on the planet. We're starting with 75 million. And actually, Patty and Jessica, Reed Hastings is supporting us in doing that.
That's surprising.
No, she's being cynical.
Yeah.
I love that, it's the mistakes, it's the audacious stuff that we try that is, never going to work. And yet all those mistakes lead you to, like, as soon as you try it and it works, you get that energy, right? And do you see that, Jessica, still? I mean, or do people come in with big ideas still? And can they maintain it once they start playing with the system that you're part of?
Well, I think my systems are a little
Smaller.
different.
Yeah.
Or just more ingrained. I do think my firm that I work with, we are very much a long-term investor where, a lot of other firms are looking for, in 3 to 5 years,
Yeah.
they want a return. I work at a firm who invested in Netflix and, was in Netflix for 20 years.
Yeah, right.
But I think going back to the systems and the things that allow for, and it's not even failure, I think they are mistakes, but it's learning, right? I mean, like your folks were failing, but in a sense they weren't. They were learning because they were making it up. They were totally looking at this problem and trying to figure out how to solve it. And it's sort of like, being an explorer, if you will, because you don't know the right path to take. And, you're going to go forge this new territory and try this new thing. And it's like, that didn't work. Like, let's go down this path and see if that works. And I think that a lot of entrepreneurs and investment firms aren't up for that journey, right? But when you are building a company from scratch, it is an adventure. It isn't a journey. And no one knows how it's going to play out, right? You hope it plays out well. And I think what you're doing, Jacqueline, is something that we think a lot about, and you're probably investing a lot more than we are, but it's building that infrastructure to help these entrepreneurs achieve this dream, this vision, this thing that they want to disrupt, to help make it possible, because they don't come with all the tools and all the knowledge and the pattern recognition maybe that we have on a few things that they've never had. But I'd love to hear more about your education, because I think that's really important. And there's not enough time spent on building great leaders, I think. But I'd love to hear your perspective on that, because I think it's one thing to have a great idea and want to disrupt something, but then as your company grows, you really do have to become a leader if you're going to stay in that role at the helm.
That's right. Well, one thing, Jessica, as you were talking, I was wondering if it's similar in your world. And what really differentiates our world is that the customers, my world, focuses on make $1, $2, or $3 a day. And so you've got to make everything work, sort of like Ginger Rogers dancing backwards. And it's a slightly different mindset. We call often the first 5-7 years the time of wandering in the desert, respectfully. And so I think it's what you're saying. And I wonder if there's the equivalent there.
Right. It is. Yeah, I think that's very same. It's just, wandering in the desert, wandering through the forest.
Yeah. In terms of the leadership, and thank you for that question, because it is often betting on people who have the grit, have the vision, but they don't have all the technical tools. And frankly, we've learned that what they need from us is often not the technical tools, that we can help them get that in other places. We give them the leadership tools. And I was just actually with this awesome guy named Dr. Faseha, who's Ethiopian. And when I saw him, I remembered that I'd met him in 2012. He had just graduated college in Ethiopia. And he was working with an early investment of ours at the time and a company called Ethio Chicken. It was founded by two guys, neither of whom had ever held a live chicken in their life, but had the audacity to decide that they could reinvent the Ethiopian non-existent chicken industry because it had until then been run by the government, and it was pretty much in shambles. We took a bet on them because of that grit. But early on, they asked us if we would train Faseha, this young, he must have been like all of 22 years old at the time. And we trained them in knowing self, getting comfort in times of uncertainty. When you have two goals that you have to hold simultaneously, including profit and purpose, including people who've been overlooked, and also getting to effectiveness and efficiency, working within the context of traditional communities and trying to get people to do what they needed to do where the individual would get credit. All of that is leadership. All of that is hard. It's also incredibly lonely. And so we found that building cohorts of these entrepreneurial builders becomes critical because they teach each other, but they also accompany each other. And so knowing their safe harbor when there's sabotage, which there will be, people will burn down your factory when you have the courage to hire people from the Dalit caste in India, for instance. We just had a horrendous experience where we don't have our entrepreneur any longer. Just there's a lot of stuff that's going to happen to you. Droughts and floods,
Right.
Climate change is making this even harder. How do you build that resilience? How do you keep your belief in goodness and hold trust while also verifying? How do you partner with people you might even consider your enemies? You want to make change in the world in which we're working, those entrepreneurs have to build those skills. And so when I saw Faseha 2 months ago in Ghana, he was actually now taking this Ethio chicken, which met him in Ethiopia 12 years ago, taking it to West Africa. And he had now 150 employees. So Faseha had taken this company from Ethiopia, a part of this company, into West Africa. He was overseeing Ghana, the Ivory Coast, and he was intending to expand into Burkina Faso. And the holdco last year had sold 43 million chickens and sold 3.5 billion eggs. It injected about $800 million into the economy. And I said, Faseha, how do we help you now build West Africa? And he said, I think I'd like you to train my people in leadership. And I said, help me understand what you're talking about. And he said, I can find the technical skills. I need those moral skills that you taught me back in 2012. And I was like, yes.
Yeah.
I think that is what increasingly the entrepreneurs understand. It's exactly what you're saying, Jessica. When you are going against a status quo that likes the way it is, you are going against a system that has no interest in your success. And so you have to learn how to fight bureaucracy, complacency, corruption, and still have patience and kindness. That they don't teach you at business school.
Which is hard to do when you're fighting all those things.
It's hard to do when you haven't been paid for 5 months.
Yeah.
And you feel like a loser and your society doesn't say you're successful and you do it anyway.
And so tell me about women that you work with in that situation, because they also have that additional burden of probably having very few expectations of them set, and then being able to make a difference and make a change in that way.
Absolutely. And it's at multiple levels, Patty. I mean, my whole management team is female. And so we're always out there finding those extraordinary women too, and trying to model that sense of belonging and that we belong at these tables, particularly in places where women really doubt whether that might be true for them. We also have incredible role models who use the different lenses of their sort of outsider status in ways that help them have superpowers. So I'm thinking of a woman named Sara Khurram Saeed, Pakistani woman, who, like many privileged Pakistani women, parents really wanted her to have a good education because then you would be a good marriage prospect. And so she became a doctor, and she loved being a doctor. And then she had a baby, and all expectations were that she would stay home and care for her baby. That was not in her dream. I don't know if she went into or she just had postpartum depression, and decided this cannot be my path. And so realized that it took her to that space where she realized that 70% of all women doctors in Pakistan don't work. And so you have this incredible resource. And when you look at the rural areas, most rural women would only see a female doctor. So not only are you extinguishing one of your most valuable resources, but you're not meeting one of your most critical needs. And so Sarah early, super early, started to do telemedicine with her assistant in her office, and then started to build that up. She became a fellow with us. And during COVID, when all the private clinics were shut down, she built an app and it was game on. And I think they've had like 6 million people be served by her. She is working with government to make telemedicine part of the government health system. And she's partnered with another one of our fellows who works with women in prisons to bring telemedicine into prisons for women and their children. And so there are the fierce women that just blow my mind.
Yeah.
Then there are the women who are empowered within the companies. And so we have a company called Fool, which means flower in Hindi. It's in India. And it's a guy who saw flowers floating in the river Ganges, covered in arsenic, cadmium, lead, nitrates. And so followed the thread of his curiosity and built a company. He realized that the flowers were there because every day Indians would bring flowers to the temples as blessings to the gods. The priests didn't want to desecrate the blessings, so they would throw them into the sacred rivers, but they were, of course, polluting the rivers and then the people who were doing their ablutions in the rivers. So Ankit Agarwal built this company where he would get the flowers from the temples, only hire women from the scavenger caste, who until then were consigned to collect human feces from latrines and in the streets. It's really the only occupation they had. And he fought like hell to make this work. And he was the guy whose first factory was destroyed. Then he's like, okay, that's fine, but I need to have a bus to get to their community to bring them to my factory.
That's fine. Can you imagine?
I'm not stopping. You're not stopping me.
Yeah. I'll burn down my factory. Okay, next.
Couldn't get a bus driver to take the bus. Finally found a bus driver to get the women, bring them there. And so you talk about human beings that feel fully unempowered to participate. And when I went to the factory, which is really just beautiful dried marigolds and roses and tuberose, in the sun, with all these women sitting on these little plastic chairs about a foot high, I said to one of the women, I'm trying to get my mind around the work you do now, the work you used to do, and what it means to you. And she said, well, I've never been treated with dignity like this. I said, can you give me an example? And she said, this is the first time in my life that anybody has ever offered me a chair on which to sit. And of course, this was a $1 plastic little, looked like an overturned colander. Yeah. And the women would talk really candidly about coming in without confidence, not thinking they could do the job, but over time seeing that they're good at it, and how that actually changes their relationships, and how for the first time in their lives, they've invited people into their community. And now they're the ones in the community that have a television that other neighbors can come and watch. And so when I think about if you think about poverty, you're talking mostly about women and their children. Two, when you look at our companies, increasingly our entrepreneurs understand that it makes a lot of sense to hire women. They tend to show up for work on time, not drink, stay later.
Hey, going from feces to flowers is a pretty big incentive, if you ask me.
I mean, it's extraordinary. You can't make up this. They're so beautiful, these stories, and they're so simple and
beautiful.
And you can't help but ask yourself, why, when this is not rocket science, when we have these tools of investment, yet we hide behind risk. We hide behind not looking smart because we're not making a ton of money. Hide behind excuses that allow us to have a world where a good 2 billion of us are fully kept out of the possibilities that would allow them to not only flourish for themselves, but make our world all that much more beautiful, more productive, cleaner. And it's all there for us. And I think that's what I want to find, ways to tell different kinds of stories and push the systems for the rest of my life, because 7-year-olds would understand this. Right? So
Yeah.
the rest of us have to get on board.
I have a 4-year-old who would understand it, I think.
4-year-olds understand it.
Yeah.
Here's our confessions from one of our listeners who sent this in. I am the executive director for a small nonprofit in youth work. We went through a financial crisis last year because of the IRS glitch that was out of control, resulting in having to lay off the only other adult director level employee. We're now recovering, but slowly. I'm looking for advice on the idea that you have got to spend money to make money. Since I'm the only director level employee, the rest being youth workers, a lot of programming oversight falls to me, along with the general ed roles of community building, finance, grant writing, etc. Do I hire someone to take on some of the programming responsibilities so I can focus on bringing in money? I don't want to put us in another tight financial situation.
Well, that's an easy one. Yes, yes, yes,
Yeah.
and yes.
Yes.
That, I talk a lot about this with Acumen's fellows as part of our academy. The social sector, the nonprofit sector can just wear you down, and it often results in a poverty of ambition. It's what Jessica was talking about before. It's nobody's fault per se, but we have a system where donors like to give small amounts of money to feel good, and they want to make sure you don't have a lot of money or they won't be as important for your organization. That is a completely broken system. And again, I think because of my experience both on Wall Street and at Rockefeller, when I started Acumen, it's like, look, we want to take on the hardest problems in the world. I do not want to hire people who just want to feel good, nor do I want to hire people who just want to make money, but they need to be more skilled than your average investor. They have to be more skilled than your average marketer, because we're making everything up. And this is not about doing good things. This is about solving the biggest challenges of our lifetime. And so if you're uncomfortable paying for my people who are already taking massive reductions in their salaries, we're not the org for you. And so I would say to this amazing person who's taken on young people, first of all, find a CFO who could really help you understand the numbers. And it may be you have to shrink your org, or it may be you have to find a good donor or even take a loan. But get in the talent that allows you to build what you dream of building, or call it quits and start again.
Exactly. I mean, I totally hear you. I've done so much work with nonprofits since, I've been consulting on my own. And it's funny, there's kind of this mindset that sets in that says, it's impossible. I can't. I'll never have enough money. I'll never have enough people. I want to make a difference how I do it. And there's this sort of, I don't know, this self-imposed, I can only do it myself, right? And it's a different way of thinking that those of us who came from the business world into the nonprofit world, which is, oh, no, you can't. No. You have to have a team, and the team has to matter. And so that's a really interesting insight to that question. Thank you for helping us answer that question.
Thank you so much for chatting with us. I learned so much in this conversation. I'm very grateful to you and the work that you're doing around the world.
Mostly, and to say it to two talent people, you understand it more than anybody. mostly just because I have one skill, and that's hiring people who are so much smarter and better at what they do than I could
It's
ever
the
be.
best,
That's
isn't
the trick.
it?
That's the trick.
Thanks for listening to TruthWorks. This episode was produced and edited by Megan Hayward and Mick Finnegan. Thank you to Kathleen Speckert and the whole Edit Audio team.